The wealthy man, Robert, had always been known for his sharp business mind. His life was a mixture of luxury and status, filled with all the trappings of success. He had a beautiful wife, Claire, whom he had married years ago when they were both young. Their relationship started like any other, full of hope and promise. They had built a life together, traveled to exotic places, and enjoyed the kind of wealth that many could only dream of. Claire was kind, supportive, and always by his side, a constant source of stability. But as time passed, Robert began to feel that something was missing. The spark that once made their relationship special had slowly faded into routine. They still cared for each other, but the connection that had once been so vibrant seemed to weaken with each passing day. Robert was no longer the young man full of dreams and excitement. He had become a successful businessman, consumed by his work and his desire for more. Claire, though still supportive, had settled into her own life, and the energy between them had become more of a friendship than a passionate romance. It was during one of his business trips that Robert met Julia. She was young, lively, and full of energy. Everything Robert's life with Claire wasn't anymore. She was different in every way, and their connection was immediate. Julia was not just attractive, but had a certain charm and carefree attitude that made Robert feel alive again. Every moment with her felt new and exciting, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had found something that could truly ignite his passion. At first, Robert tried to ignore the pull he felt toward Julia. He was married, after all, and he didn't want to hurt Claire. But the more he spent time with Julia, the harder it became to resist. They would talk for hours, laugh together, and share stories of their lives. The chemistry between them was undeniable. Robert told himself it was just a fleeting thing, that it would pass. But it didn't. It only grew stronger. One evening, after yet another intense conversation with Julia, Robert found himself at a crossroads. He stood on the balcony of his hotel room, staring at the city lights, deep in thought. He knew he had a good life with Claire. She had been his partner for so long. But in the quiet moments of reflection, he realized that the life they shared no longer brought him the joy it once did. The decision weighed heavily on him. In the end, it wasn't an easy choice, but Robert convinced himself that he had to follow his heart, even if it meant ending his marriage. He thought that with Julia, he could start fresh, perhaps even rediscover who he truly was. His emotions were conflicted, but the temptation of a new life with Julia was too strong to ignore. The decision to leave Claire was not made lightly, but Robert believed that it was the only way to find happiness again. When he finally told Claire, she was heartbroken. She had suspected something was wrong, but the reality of Robert's choice still crushed her. They had spent years together, built a life, but now it was coming to an end. Robert tried to explain, but no words could take away the hurt. The life he had known was over, and the future was uncertain. Robert walked away from his past, and with Julia, he set out to begin a new chapter in his life, unaware of the long-lasting consequences of his decision. As Robert settled into his new life with Julia, he thought everything would be different. The excitement of leaving his past behind and embracing a fresh start with someone younger and more vibrant filled him with hope. Julia was everything Robert had wanted in those moments when he felt disconnected from his marriage. She was spontaneous, adventurous, and made him feel alive in ways Claire hadn't in years. At first, everything felt perfect. Their days were filled with laughter and discovery, enjoying new experiences together. Robert felt like he had found a new version of himself, one that was carefree and unburdened by the responsibilities that had weighed him down in his previous life. Julia's energy was contagious, and Robert could barely remember the man he used to be, the man who was tied to the steady routine of a marriage he no longer felt connected to. But soon, the reality of their life together began to sink in. Robert found himself working more hours to maintain the luxurious lifestyle he had built. The excitement he once felt about being with Julia began to fade. She, too, started to change. The early days of their relationship, filled with flirtation and playful romance, gave way to the demands of their life together. Julia began to express her expectations. More attention, more adventures, more of everything Robert wasn't sure he could provide without stretching himself too thin. He had underestimated how hard it would be to balance his business and personal life. Though Julia didn't want for anything in the material sense, she still sought his constant attention. She had her own dreams and ambitions, and sometimes it felt like she expected him to be everything: her partner, her confidant, and her source of excitement. Robert began to realize that the excitement he once felt now seemed like a burden. There were days when he felt overwhelmed by the weight of keeping up appearances, trying to keep both Julia and his business happy. Despite his best efforts, the cracks in their relationship started to show. Arguments became more frequent, centered on misunderstandings and unmet expectations. Robert started to miss the stability Claire had provided, even though their marriage had ended. At night, he would find himself thinking back to their quieter days, the comfort of knowing that their lives were predictable and steady. He wondered if he had made a mistake by choosing the uncertain, chaotic life with Julia. But even in those moments of doubt, Robert didn't want to face the truth that perhaps he had been too hasty in making his decision. The memory of Claire and the life they shared began to creep back into his mind. Yet he was too proud to admit to anyone, least of all himself, that he was feeling regret. Julia, too, began to change. The woman who had been so free-spirited and full of life seemed to be growing restless. She wanted more than what Robert could give her. The newness of their relationship had worn off, and it wasn't as easy to keep the excitement alive. The challenges of their life together, once hidden beneath the surface, were now coming to the forefront, leaving Robert wondering if he had truly made the right choice after all. Their once effortless connection began to feel strained, but Robert wasn't ready to face the possibility that perhaps their story would not end the way he had imagined. As the years passed, Robert found himself living a life that was not quite what he had expected. On the surface, things appeared perfect. He had everything he could want: wealth, a beautiful partner in Julia, and a lifestyle that many envied. But deep down, something was missing. The excitement of his new relationship had faded, and he began to notice how different his life was compared to what it once was with Claire. It wasn't that Julia wasn't a good partner. It was just that the dynamics between them had shifted, and Robert realized that he was beginning to feel the weight of his decision. Julia had changed too. When they first got together, she had been the free-spirited woman who made every day feel like an adventure. But as time went on, the pressure to maintain their glamorous lifestyle and keep up appearances started to take its toll on her as well. She had once been carefree and spontaneous, but now she seemed more distant, and the excitement that had drawn Robert to her in the first place seemed to be slipping away. The fun-filled weekends away had turned into stressful, overscheduled affairs, and the joy of discovery had become overshadowed by expectations. Robert felt as though he was stuck in a never-ending cycle of chasing something that he couldn't quite grasp. He missed the days when things were simpler, when he and Claire could sit quietly and talk about their dreams without the constant pressure of trying to make everything perfect. But even as those memories lingered in his mind, he knew he could never go back. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. He tried to focus on his business, throwing himself into work to distract himself from the growing sense of dissatisfaction. But even success didn't fill the void he was feeling. It was as if he had everything, but something essential was missing. He missed the quiet, the calm, the sense of partnership he had once shared with Claire. He wondered if he had taken it all for granted, if the comfort of stability had blinded him to how much he truly valued it. As the months turned into years, Robert began to question everything he thought he knew about love and relationships. He had been so sure that leaving Claire for a younger woman would bring him happiness. Yet with time, he began to realize that he had traded stability for excitement. And now he wasn't sure which one was more important. The lessons he had learned from his marriage to Claire, the patience, the understanding, and the deep emotional connection, seemed like distant memories. And in their place, There was a growing sense of loneliness that he couldn't shake. Julia, too, was becoming more and more restless. She had her own desires, her own ambitions, and she began to express how she was feeling about their relationship. She felt like she was losing herself in trying to please Robert, and the more she tried to keep things exciting, the more it seemed to backfire. The cracks in their relationship were starting to show, and no amount of money or adventure could patch them up. Robert's life, once full of promise and excitement, had become a quiet reflection of what could have been. He wondered if he had missed his chance for true happiness by leaving Claire for something he thought would be better. But the question now was, could he fix it? Would it be possible to go back to the life he had left behind? Or had the past truly slipped away forever? Years had passed since Robert left Claire for Julia, and life had unfolded in ways he hadn't anticipated. As the months turned into years, Robert found himself moving further away from the life he once knew. His relationship with Julia, once filled with the spark of new love, had grown more routine. The days of spontaneous trips and late-night conversations were now replaced with familiar routines and unspoken tension. Even though they still spent time together, Robert often felt a sense of emptiness he couldn't explain. It was at a charity gala that Robert's life unexpectedly took another turn. He had been invited to attend as a part of a networking event, where the city's most influential people gathered to celebrate causes and make connections. As he mingled among the guests, he was caught off guard when he saw Claire across the room. She looked just as graceful and beautiful as he remembered, though she appeared more at ease, more composed than before. Robert froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. He hadn't seen Claire in years, and the emotions he had buried deep inside seemed to resurface. Claire, now remarried, had maintained a certain quiet elegance over the years. Their marriage had been long and loving, but it was clear that their paths had diverged. Despite the time that had passed, she greeted him with a warm smile, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. They exchanged pleasantries, speaking about mutual acquaintances and how life had unfolded for each of them. It was a civil conversation, yet beneath the surface, Robert could feel the weight of his past decisions. He couldn't help but notice how much Claire had changed in the years since their separation. She was content, comfortable in her own skin, and seemed to have moved on with her life. Her new husband, a kind and attentive man, stood by her side, and Robert couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. It was clear that Claire had found a sense of peace, something Robert had been seeking, but had yet to find. As the conversation continued, Robert found himself reflecting on the past, realizing how much he had missed. The life he had once shared with Claire, filled with quiet moments, shared dreams, and unconditional support, now seemed so far away. There was no denying that Robert had changed, but so had Claire. She no longer seemed like the woman who had once stood by his side. The years had shaped both of them, and the bond they had shared was no longer the same. After a while, the conversation naturally came to an end, and Robert watched Claire walk away, arm in arm with her husband. The encounter left him with a sense of emptiness he couldn't quite shake. He tried to ignore the thoughts that flooded his mind, telling himself that he had made the right decision all those years ago. But deep down, Robert couldn't escape the feeling that something had been lost, something irreplaceable. The meeting with Claire left Robert with more questions than answers. He wondered what would have happened if he had stayed. Would they have found a way to rekindle the love they once shared? Or was their relationship always destined to fade into the background of their busy lives? He realized, too late, that love required more than just passion. It required commitment, effort, and a willingness to grow together. As he left the event that evening, Robert couldn't help but reflect on how his life had turned out. The excitement and thrill of his relationship with Julia, which had once seemed like the answer to all of his problems, now felt hollow. He had lost something valuable, something he couldn't get back. And though the past couldn't be rewritten, Robert knew he would have to face the consequences of his choices. The question now was whether he could find a way to move forward, or if he was doomed to remain trapped in a life that never truly satisfied him. One bright Saturday afternoon, Robert was attending a business conference at an exclusive hotel when something unexpected happened. After a long day of meetings and presentations, he found himself wandering into a quiet area near the hotel's garden. The space was peaceful, away from the noise of the crowd, offering a moment of calm. As he walked past a small play area, he spotted a family. The children, a group of 4, were laughing and playing with a ball. They looked remarkably similar to him, with the same deep-set eyes, the same sharp jawline, and even the same small smile that he often saw in the mirror. Robert stopped in his tracks, feeling a sudden jolt of surprise. He blinked, unsure if he was seeing things correctly. The resemblance between him and these children was striking. They weren't just a little similar, they looked as if they could be his own. The children, though young, carried an undeniable resemblance to Robert, each one more similar to him than the last. The 4 of them moved in perfect unison, their laughter echoing through the garden as if they were part of some shared secret. His heart began to race, and a sense of disbelief washed over him. Could these children actually be his? Robert's mind raced, replaying memories from the past. He had known he had left Claire for Julia, but the thought of having children with Claire, especially children who were so alike him, had never crossed his mind. Robert had never even imagined what it would be like to have children of his own. His life had been so consumed by business and his pursuit of new beginnings that he hadn't thought about the family he had left behind. As Robert tried to gather his thoughts, he couldn't help but feel the pull of curiosity. He stepped closer to the children, trying to gather the courage to speak to them. He noticed their mother, a woman sitting on a nearby bench, watching her children with a smile. Her face was vaguely familiar, but it took Robert a moment to place her. It was then that the truth hit him. This woman was Claire. The same woman he had left behind all those years ago. She had remarried, and these children were hers. And his. His heart raced as he watched Claire interact with the children. They seemed so happy, so comfortable in their own little world. And yet, Robert felt like an outsider looking in. He hadn't realized how much time had passed, or how much life had changed for Claire. She had a family, a life that didn't include him. And now, standing before him, was the evidence of their past. A past he had left behind without a second thought. The shock of seeing his children for the first time was overwhelming. Robert stood frozen for a few moments, unsure of what to do next. He wanted to walk up to Claire, to ask about them, to understand how this had all happened. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had left her behind. And now it seemed like the past had caught up with him in the most unexpected way. He stood there, staring at his children, wondering what could have been. His mind was swirling with emotions: guilt, disbelief, regret. He had never imagined this moment would come, and yet here it was, staring him in the face. He had a family, 4 children who looked so much like him, but he had never been a part of their lives. Robert couldn't help but wonder if they had ever known about him, or if they even realized that he was their father. Would they even want to know him now? As he turned to leave, Robert felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The encounter had shaken him to his core. He had thought that his decision to leave Claire was the right one, but now he was left questioning everything. He had lost so much: the family, the connection, the life he had once known. And all he could do now was wonder what could have been if he had made different choices. The next few days after the encounter in the garden were a blur for Robert. The faces of the children haunted him, and he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something had been left undone in his life. The resemblance between the Quadruplets and himself was so striking that he couldn't get them out of his mind. For the first time in years, Robert felt a deep sense of regret. The life he had built with Julia, the new beginning he had thought would solve everything, now felt hollow and distant compared to the truth that had just been uncovered. The moment he got back to his apartment, Robert found himself pacing. His thoughts were scattered, each one pointing to the same question. Could those children really be his? He had never known about them. His marriage to Claire had ended long before they were born, so how could they be his? But the resemblance was undeniable, and the thought gnawed at him. Unable to ignore his growing sense of curiosity, Robert made the decision to call Claire. It took him several attempts before he finally dialed her number. His hands trembled slightly as the phone rang. Claire had moved on with her life, and Robert hadn't been a part of it for years. He didn't even know if she would answer. But after a few rings, the familiar voice on the other end of the line sent a wave of both comfort and anxiety through him. "Hello." Claire's voice was calm, almost too calm, as though she had expected this moment to come one day. "Claire," Robert said, his voice filled with hesitation. It's Robert. I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk to you." There was a brief silence before Claire replied, her tone a little guarded but still kind. "What is it, Robert? What's going on?" He didn't know where to begin. How could he explain everything he had seen, everything he was feeling? Finally, he just asked the question that had been burning in his mind since that afternoon. "Are those children my children?" His voice cracked slightly as the words left his lips, and he regretted asking the moment he did. He had left Claire, and now here he was, asking about kids he didn't even know he had. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Robert could hear Claire take a deep breath before she spoke. "Yes, Robert, they're yours." Her words were soft, but Robert could hear the pain in them. She had never wanted to tell him, had never expected that it would be a topic of discussion. It had been a secret, one she had kept for their own sake, and now, years later, the truth was spilling out. The weight of those words settled heavily on Robert's chest. The children he had seen were his, and yet he had no relationship with them. He hadn't even known they existed. Claire continued, explaining how she had raised them on her own, how difficult it had been without him. Robert felt a deep ache in his heart as he listened. He had been so focused on his own life, his own desires, that he had missed this, his own family. For the first time in years, Robert felt the sharp sting of guilt. He had left, thinking he was making the right choice, but he hadn't considered the consequences. He hadn't thought about the children he could have had, about the life he could have shared with Claire. It was all slipping away, and he had no one to blame but himself. Claire told him that the children were growing up without him, but they were happy. They didn't know their father, and Claire had tried to shield them from the hurt of him leaving. She had given them everything, but Robert could tell that she had sacrificed so much, and all of it for them. She had built a life without him, and while she was doing well, there was still an emptiness that had never gone away. She didn't say it, but Robert knew she had always hoped that he would come back. When the conversation ended, Robert sat quietly for a long time, lost in his thoughts. The world around him felt like it was moving in slow motion, and all he could think about was the family he had missed. He had once believed that leaving Claire for something better was the right choice, but now he was filled with regret. The children he had never known, the love he had taken for granted, and the life he could have had were all slipping through his fingers. There was no way to turn back time, no way to fix what had been broken. As he sat in the quiet of his apartment, Robert realized that some things, once lost, could never be regained, and yet there was still a part of him that wanted to make things right. The question now was whether the children would even want to know him, or if he had missed his chance forever. The next few weeks were filled with turmoil for Robert. The conversation with Claire had shaken him to his core. The revelation that he had children, 4 of them, whom he had never known about, weighed heavily on his mind. Every moment felt like a tug-of-war between regret and hope. He had thought that his life with Julio was the answer to everything, but now he couldn't help but wonder if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. After much contemplation, Robert knew he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The need to connect with his children, to find out more about them, became all-consuming. He had to try, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult it might be. So he made a decision to reach out to Claire again, to ask about his children and how he could get involved in their lives. The conversation was more difficult than he had anticipated. When Robert called Claire, his heart raced. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he needed to make this right. The phone rang a few times before Claire picked up. Her voice, though warm, carried a tinge of uncertainty. "Hello, Robert," she said. "Hi, Claire," Robert began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about, and I want to be a part of their lives. I want to meet them, get to know them. I know it's a lot to ask, but I can't live with the regret of not trying." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Robert could almost hear Claire thinking, processing his request. Finally, she responded. "Robert, it's not that simple. They've grown up without you, and they're used to their lives the way they are. They don't know you. It might be difficult for them to accept you, and it might be harder for you to accept the reality of who they've become." Robert nodded, though Claire couldn't see him. He knew she was right. The children didn't know him. To them, he was just a name, someone from the past who had left. But Robert couldn't ignore the feeling that he had a responsibility to try, to be a part of their lives, even if it meant facing the consequences of his decisions. He had to try, no matter how difficult. "I understand," Robert said softly. "I don't want to cause any trouble. I just want to be there for them, if they'll let me. I know it might take time, but I'm willing to put in the effort. I just need a chance." Claire sighed, and for a moment, Robert wasn't sure what she was thinking. Then she spoke again, her voice filled with both hesitation and hope. "All right, Robert. I'll talk to them, but I can't promise anything. It's going to take time, and I don't know how they'll feel about you being in their lives. They've grown up without you, and that's been their reality." The conversation ended on a note of uncertainty. Robert hung up, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. At least Claire had agreed to speak with the children, but he knew this was only the first step in what could be a long, painful process. He had no idea how his children would react, and the thought of them not wanting anything to do with him was a constant worry. But despite the fear, Robert also felt a small flicker of hope. He had taken the first step toward reconnecting with his family, and that was something. Over the next few days, Robert continued to reflect on his past and the life he had left behind. He knew that he couldn't undo the mistakes he had made, but he could try to build something new with his children. It wouldn't be easy, and it might not be perfect, but he was determined to do whatever it took. When Robert received Claire's call a few days later, his heart raced again. This time, when he answered, her tone was more cautious, but there was a softness in her voice. "They're open to meeting you," she said. "It's going to be awkward at first, but they're willing to give it a chance. We'll meet at the park on Sunday, if that's okay with you." Robert felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had taken the first step, and now he had the chance to meet his children, to get to know them. There was still so much to prove, but for the first time in a long while, Robert felt like he was on the path to redemption. He didn't know where it would lead, but he was ready to try. Sunday arrived with a mix of excitement and nervousness for Robert. He had spent the past few days thinking about the upcoming meeting with his children. What would it be like? Would they accept him? Could he really build a relationship with them, despite the years of absence? He dressed carefully, wanting to make a good first impression, but deep down, he knew that the process wouldn't be easy. He was about to meet 4 children he had never known, children who had lived their whole lives without him. When he arrived at the park, Claire was already there, sitting on a bench, watching the children play. They were laughing, running around, enjoying the sunny day without a care in the world. Robert stood for a moment, just watching them from a distance. They were beautiful, so full of life, and each one had some feature of his, whether it was the way they smiled or the way they moved. It made his heart ache to realize how much he had missed. Claire looked up and saw him standing there. She gave a small, tentative smile, motioning for him to come over. Robert took a deep breath and walked toward her. As he sat down beside her, she gave him a look of quiet support. The moment felt surreal, and Robert could feel the weight of the moment on his shoulders. This was the moment of truth, his chance to start building a relationship with his children. "Are you ready?" Claire asked softly. Robert nodded, though his throat felt tight. "I think so." Just then, one of the children, a girl with dark hair and bright eyes, noticed them and ran over. She stopped short when she saw Robert. He couldn't help but notice how much she looked like him. She had the same strong features, the same look of curiosity in her eyes. There was no denying it. This little girl and the others were his children. "Hi," the girl said shyly, looking up at Robert with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Hi," Robert replied, his voice a little shaky. "I'm Robert." The girl smiled but said nothing more, looking over her shoulder at her siblings. Robert could see the uncertainty in her expression, but there was also something else. Something that told him she was willing to give him a chance, even if just a small one. Slowly, one by one, the other children joined them, each of them eyeing Robert carefully. They didn't speak much, and the silence between them was heavy. Robert wanted to say something, to break the ice, but he wasn't sure what to say. How could he explain the years of absence? How could he justify the choices he had made? Finally, Claire spoke up, her voice steady but kind. "I think they're just getting used to the idea, Robert. They've never known you, and it's going to take time for them to understand what this means." Robert nodded, understanding. It wasn't going to be easy, but at least this was a start. After a while, the children began to warm up a little. They showed him some of the things they had been doing, games they liked to play, drawings they had made, things that were important to them. Robert found himself laughing with them, enjoying their innocence and energy. It was hard not to feel a sense of joy, even as he recognized how much time had been lost. The afternoon went by slowly, with small, cautious steps toward connection. The children didn't say much, but Robert could feel that they were beginning to accept his presence. He didn't expect them to immediately call him Dad or anything like that. It would take time. But for now, this was enough. The simple fact that they were willing to spend time with him, to let him into their world, was a huge step forward. As the sun began to set, Claire stood up, signaling that it was time to leave. The children said their goodbyes, some more warmly than others, but all of them had at least acknowledged him. Robert felt a mix of emotions: pride, relief, and a deep sadness for all the years that had passed. He had missed so much, and there was no way to get those years back. But what he could do now was move forward. "I'll be here again," Robert said to the children as they were leaving, his voice steady now. "I'll keep coming back, if you'll let me." The words were simple, but they held weight. They weren't a promise of perfection, but they were a commitment to try, to be there for them in whatever way he could. As Robert watched them walk away, a small but hopeful smile tugged at his lips. It wasn't the happy reunion he had once imagined, but it was a start. It was the beginning of something new, something that had been lost but could still be rebuilt. And for the first time in a long while, Robert felt a sense of peace. It wasn't too late to change, to make things right, to build a relationship with his children. It was going to take time, effort, and patience, but it was possible. And for that, Robert was grateful.